Foreign and Military Intelligence, Part 47. Resuming page 577. Cuban support to the Chilean government was primarily in the security field. The Cubans trained and armed the Presidential Security Guard and also helped to develop an intelligence organization which functioned independently of established government services. Chilean police were trained in repressive security tactics, such as setting up neighborhood informant systems. The Cubans also provided arms, funds, and guerrilla training to hundreds of members of the Socialist Party and other far leftist Chilean militia groups. Dozens of crates of arms, mostly of Soviet and Czech origin, were found stored in Allende's Santiago home and mountain retreat after he was overthrown. These crates had been flown in as, quote, gifts, end quote, by Cuban Airlines. The Cuban intelligence effort in Chile concentrated on exporting revolution to other Latin American countries, primarily Bolivia, but also Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Some 10 to 15,000 foreign revolutionaries flocked into Chile, where the Cuban LD Center conducted a thriving business. The center had a unit for providing false documents and training, and its operatives met revolutionaries in exile and visitors from other countries to receive their reports, pass money, arrange travel to Cuba, and direct their activities. In 1971, Bolivian exiles in Chile announced formation of the Anti-Imperialist Revolutionary Front, known as FRA, which included the ELN. Its mission was to replace the Panzer government with a government of the, quote, proletariat, end quote. A number of FRA leaders in Chile traveled to and from Cuba. A massing of FRA exiles on the Chilean border drew official protests from the Bolivian government in April 1972. Chile also served as a support base for the Argentinian terrorist organization PRT/ERP. Subsequently, the PRT/ERP was responsible for such actions as the abduction and shooting of a State Department official, and for extracting ransom in excess of $20 million from U.S. firms in Argentina. Subsection 4. Actions of Allende's coalition subsequent to the March 1973 elections. Like other Unidad Popular parties, the Communist Party, known as the PCCH, began almost immediately after Allende's election to arm and train its membership in paramilitary tactics. Prior to March 1973, however, the Communist Party publicly and privately advocated policies designed to lull the political opposition and military into believing that the government would not resort to flagrant violations of the Chilean Constitution. The PCCH believed that time was on the side of the government and that the political opposition would be effectively stifled by progressively increasing government control of the economy. This posture change with the March 1973 congressional elections, which showed that the Christian Democrats and other parties in the political opposition were gaining rather than losing ground. The communists, realizing that force was the only way to guarantee the continuance of the Marxist government, then joined the Socialist Party in pressing Allende to take harsher measures against opposition. End of page 577, beginning page 578. After the September 1st, 1973 coup, the junta government charged that the Unidad Popular had been planning a terrorist action, which was known as, quote, Plan Z, end quote, and called for the assassination of military and opposition leaders as part of a move to secure total control of the country. A reliable leftist source who was in Chile prior to and during the military rebellion confirmed that the leftist forces had indeed planned a preemptive move against the military to have taken place during the independence celebrations of September 17 through 18, 1973. The documents and large arms caches discovered by military authorities after the coup suggest that Plan Z may have indeed existed. A complete and fair assessment of the U.S. role in Chile can only be made if the following are taken into account. 1. The character of the Allende regime as revealed by public statements and by the nature of the political parties from which he drew support. 2. Efforts of the Allende regime to manipulate and ultimately destroy constitutional democracy. 3. Soviet and Cuban use of Chile as a base for international subversion. 4. The possibility that the Marxists were planning a preemptive and bloody coup to seize power totally. The Senate Select Committee staff report on Chile concludes that, quote, fears, often badly exaggerated and distorted, appear to have activated officials in Washington, end quote. But even the National Intelligence Estimate cited as endorsing this conclusion was published on June 4, 1973, and was written before Allende's violations of civil liberties were intensified. In the months after the estimate, the country's democratic processes were reduced to chaos and provoked the solemn declarations by the Supreme Court, Comptroller General, and Chamber of Deputies mentioned earlier. U.S. policy toward Chile from 1962 to 1970 was consistent in attempting to prevent the takeover of the government of Chile by Allende and his totalitarian communist and socialist supporters. The actions of the Allende regime after 1970 proves the wisdom of that policy. In Chile, the U.S. was acting within the broad mainstream of traditional U.S. policy in Latin America, which has been to resist encroachment by powers outside the Western Hemisphere. The USSR dealt with the Allende government and with the Chilean Communist Party before and after Allende's election at the very highest level. For example, the Soviet ambassador to Allende's Chile, Alexander Vasilyevich Basov was one of only 3 members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to be stationed in a non-communist capitals, the other 2 being in Washington and Paris. The Allende experiment in Chile was seen by the Soviets as a model for other strategic countries. It is worth noting that both the Soviets and the Cubans considered the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile as a disaster to their interests. In their comments on Chile, the Soviets emphasized that Chile proves the thesis that, quote, socialist revolution, end quote, should never be attempted without political control of the military forces. There can be honest differences of opinion about the wisdom of American policy toward Chile over the last decade. What is missing, end of page 578, beginning page 579, in the staff report is the acknowledgement of a viewpoint contrary to its own conception, that Washington opinion makers were activated by badly exaggerated and distorted fears. History has proved that minority communist and radical Marxist parties ultimately destroy the elements of democracy and diversity which enable them to gain power. Allende clearly stated his intent to bring about an irreversible Marxist revolution in Chile. Had the facts presented here been made available to the reader of the staff report, that reader might have concluded that U.S. government fears were not, quote, exaggerated or distorted, end quote, and might have concluded that the U.S. was essentially correct in its Chilean policy. This policy, prior to 1970, was to prevent a convinced Marxist from taking power, and after 1970, strove to support and sustain until the 1976 elections a democratic opposition to a government which, by 1973 elections, a democratic opposition to a government which, by 1973, was clearly operating outside the laws and constitution of Chile. The results of the disclosures of sensitive classified data, which were made during open hearings and in the published report on Chile, will not be evident for some time to come, but 2 recent developments may be of interest. First, the conclusion to the staff report states that, quote, it would be the final irony of a decade of covert action in Chile if that action destroyed the credibility of the Chilean Christian Democrats, end quote. According to an official report received by this government, quote, ex-President Frey feels completely shattered as a result of the release of the Senate report and has confided to his friends that it has brought his political career to a close. The source commented that it is ironic that U.S. congressional distaste for the role of the U.S. government against the Allende government may have succeeded in destroying the only viable alternative to the present Chilean government, end quote. Second, data taken from the report are being used to give credibility to false allegations about the agency. An example is the Washington Post article of January 16, 1976, by Walter Pincus, entitled, quote, CIA Funding Journalistic Network Abroad, end quote. After quoting data taken from the Chilean report, the author quotes, quote, a former intelligence agent, end quote, as claiming that the CIA subsidized the Latin American News Service, LATIN, in much the same manner as it gave money to, quote, El Mercurio, end quote. The true fact is that the CIA never gave any help, financial or otherwise, to LATIN, or Latin. But this false allegation has been tied in with facts published in the staff report in such a way as to make it appear to have the Senate's stamp of approval. As of this writing, Angola has fallen into the hands of a revolutionary group backed by the Soviet Union. The winning element was thousands of Cuban soldiers supplied with Russian weaponry. In other words, the Soviet Union used Cuban soldiers in Angola much the same way as Haitians or Hessians were employed by the British during our own Revolutionary War. To the world, the Soviet Union is boasting of its victory and the defeat of the U.S. There is an ironical, if not tragic, postlude to the report, Covert Action in Chile, 1963 to 1973. On December 17, 1975, Fidel Castro made, end of page 579, beginning page 580, a speech which quoted several paragraphs of the report. Here is Fidel Castro's accolade. We consider the revelation of the report a positive move by the Senate committee, despite the opposition of a President of the United States, even when much information was omitted because of pressure from the CIA itself and from the President's office. Foreign and military findings and recommendations. Turning to the report entitled, quote, Findings and Recommendations of the Committee, Foreign and Military, end quote, two general observations can be made. 1. Much of the supporting evidence or information for this section of the report is drawn from a series of staff studies which have not been considered by the full committee in their final form as of this writing. Moreover, the staff reports are wider in scope than the testimony taken by the full committee. 2. Recommendations for reorganization of the intelligence community are not backed up by sufficient testimony or analysis. Below are some detailed comments on the report. They follow the heading given on the quote contents end quote page. Subsection 1, Historical Note. The Select Committee on Intelligence Activities spent nearly $3 million and over 15 months investigating the intelligence community, and it had a peak staff of over 120 professionals, consultants, and clerical personnel. I believe these facts should be a matter of record because no excuses can be made for the final report based on a lack of time, money, or personnel. In fact, the Senate was more than generous in providing repeated extensions of time and money to the Select Committee. The results speak for themselves. The truth of the matter is that approximately 6 months was spent in a fruitless investigation into alleged assassination attempts. During the course of the investigation of assassination attempts, not one bona fide assassination ordered by the U.S. government was discovered. What did emerge were attempts on the life of Fidel Castro during the early 60s, when our relations with Cuba were very close to being a state of war. In any event, much time and effort was frittered away in this unproductive exercise. Section A. Introduction and General Findings. Committee Report. Allegations of abuse, revelations in the press, and the results of the committee's 15-month inquiry have underlined the necessity to restore confidence in the integrity of our nation's intelligence agencies. See page 423. End of page 580. Beginning page 581. Comment. Only a small segment of American public opinion has ever had any doubts in the integrity of our nation's intelligence agencies. In general, the American people fully support our intelligence services and recognize them as the nation's front line of defense. Accordingly, the use of the word, quote, restore, end quote, is misleading. Committee Report. At the same time, the committee finds that the operation of an extensive and necessarily secret intelligence system places severe strains on the nation's constitutional government. See page 425. Comment. It is not the operation of an intelligence system that strains our nation's constitutional government. Any strains that exist are the direct result of presidential misuse, misunderstanding, or abuse of the nation's intelligence capabilities. It should be noted that the report correctly salutes the men and women of the intelligence community and also correctly points out that the Soviet KGB and other hostile intelligence services conduct spying and covert operations, not to mention assassinations. Committee Report. The committee finds that covert action operations have not been an exceptional instrument used only in rare instances when the vital interests of the United States have been at stake. On the contrary, presidents and administrations have made excessive and at times self-defeating use of covert action. In addition, covert action has become a routine program with a bureaucratic momentum of its own. The long-term impact at home and abroad of repeated disclosure of U.S. covert action never appears to have been assessed. The cumulative effort of covert actions has been increasingly costly to American interests and reputation. The committee believes that covert action must be employed only in the most extraordinary circumstances. Comment. Covert action is intended to provide the President of the U.S. and the nation with a range of actions short of war to preserve the free world and to thwart the global ambitions of communist imperialism. Covert operations can and should be used in circumstances which might not be described as, quote, vital, end quote, but are nevertheless necessary to prevent a crisis from occurring. One of the purposes of covert action is to prevent the occurrence of, quote, most extraordinary circumstances, end quote. Those who support the above-mentioned quotation are in effect saying, quote, don't put out the fire while it is small. Wait until it becomes a conflagration, end quote. Committee report. Although there is a question as to the extent to which the Constitution requires publication of intelligence expenditures, end of page 581, beginning page 582. Information. The committee finds that the Constitution at least requires public disclosure and authorization of an annual aggregate figure for the United States national intelligence activities. See page 425. Comment. Publication of an annual aggregate figure for U.S. intelligence may appear to be innocent, especially because estimates with varying degrees of accuracy have appeared in the press. Whether or not the Constitution requires such a disclosure is open to question. Traditionally, nations have kept their intelligence budgets secret for at least two reasons. First, they did not want to officially acknowledge the fact of these activities. Second, the publication of a figure might give potential adversaries some indication of the magnitude of their intelligence efforts. Both of these arguments may be somewhat obsolete in a world where little, if anything, is considered private. There is still another objection, which I submit cannot be discounted. Disclosing an annual aggregate figure will inevitably lead to demands for a breakdown of that figure. If these demands cannot be resisted, ultimately we would hand our adversaries very important indicators concerning the magnitude and thrust of our intelligence activities. In addition, our allies would be inclined to view such a step as one more signal that America is unable to protect its secrets, leading to a possible further erosion of cooperative intelligence efforts. In any event, this matter should be decided by a vote of the entire Senate. As a note, it skips from Section A to Section D. Section B and Section C are missing or weren't put in the document. So, resuming. Section D, the National Security Council and the Office of the President. Committee report. The Central Intelligence Agency, in broad terms, is not out of control, end quote. See page 27. Comment. After having heard the CIA described as a, quote, rogue elephant run rampant, end quote, it is gratifying that the committee now finds the CIA is not, quote, out of control, end quote. Committee report 12. By statute, the Secretary of State should be designated as the principal administration spokesman to the Congress on the policy and purpose underlying covert action projects. See page 430. Comment. Making the Secretary of State the spokesman for covert action could place him in a diplomatically untenable position. What is meant by, quote, the Congress, end quote, in this context? This recommendation is vague, and if enacted into the statutes, could overburden the Secretary of State, who has more than enough work to do. End of page 582, beginning page 583. Committee report. 13. By statute, the Director of Central Intelligence should be required to fully inform the Intelligence Oversight Committee of the Congress of each covert action prior to its initiation. No funds should be expended on any covert action unless and until the President certifies and provides to the Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee that the reasons that a covert action is required by extraordinary circumstances to deal with grave threats to the national security of the United States. The Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee should be kept fully and currently informed of all covert action projects, and the DCI should submit a semi-annual report on all such projects to the committee. See page 430. Comment. As mentioned in the introduction, the operation of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment requires 6 committees to be informed of any covert action. This recommendation would merely add another layer to the cake in the absence of a repeal of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment. If the Congress could agree that only a joint committee on intelligence, or preferably the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, were to be informed, I might be able to support the concept of prior notification. Prior notification raises an important point that should be carefully considered by the Congress. Does the Congress intend to share responsibility with the President for covert actions? In other words, will the Congress be content to accept our successes as well as our failures as secrets? Committee report. 14. The committee recommends that when the Senate establishes an Intelligence Oversight Committee with authority to authorize the national intelligence budget, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment 22 U.S.C. Section 2422 should be amended so that the foregoing notifications and presidential certifications to the Senate are provided only to that committee. See page 431. Comments. This recommendation presupposes that the House of Representatives would be willing to accept the creation of a Senate committee as a sufficient reason to repeal the Hughes-Ryan Amendment. In the absence of an agreement with the House on repeal, this recommendation is meaningless. Section F, the Central Intelligence Agency. as a note, just go back and check. Yep, there is no section E. It just goes from section D to section F. Or they didn't include this. So, resuming the reading. Committee report. The committee also questions the recruiting for foreign espionage purposes of immigrants desiring American citizenship because it might be construed as coercive. See page 439. End of page 583, beginning page 584. Comment. Why should any category of foreigner be excluded from recruitment by the CIA? Does the committee have any valid reason why it, quote, questions, end quote, that any such recruitments, quote, might be construed as coercive, end quote? I submit it doesn't. Finally, if the committee believes that coercion should not be used in the handling of immigrants, then it should say so. Committee Report 27. The Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee should consider whether the Domestic Collection Service, overt collection operations, should be removed from the Directorate of Operations, the clandestine service, and returned to the Directorate of Intelligence. The CIA regulations should require that DCD's overt contacts should be informed whether they are to be used for operational support of clandestine activities. The CIA regulations should prohibit recruiting as agents immigrants who have applied for American citizenship. See page 442. Comment. Until 1973, the Domestic Contact Service was part of the Directorate of Intelligence. It was placed under the Directorate of Operations to enable the CIA to provide better support for the Foreign Resources Division, because the Domestic Contact Service has contacts with leaders in all walks of life. It possesses a unique capability to open the door for the clandestine services, requiring that the Domestic Contact Service inform overt contacts that they are to be used for operational support of clandestine activities violates the important rule of compartmentalization. As previously noted, there is no valid reason for excluding immigrants unless coercion is part of the process. Committee report. Some covert operations have passed retrospect public judgments, such as the support given Western European democratic parties facing strong communist opposition in the late 1940s and 50s. Others have not. In the view of the committee, the covert harassment of the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in Chile did not command U.S. public approval. See page 445. Comment. Here, as in other parts of the report, the story of what happened in Chile under Salvador Allende is distorted. While the Allende regime may have been, quote, democratically elected, end quote, it gradually evolved into an abusive left-wing dictatorship. See the preceding part of these individual views, entitled Covert Action in Chile, 1963 to to 1973, as well as the comments of Senator James L. Buckley in the Congressional Record of February 26, 1976. End of page 584, beginning page 585. Committee Report 36. The committee has already recommended, following its investigation of alleged assassination attempts directed at foreign leaders, a statute to forbid such activities. The committee reaffirms its support for such a statute and further recommends prohibition by statute of the following covert activities: all political assassinations, efforts to subvert democratic governments, support for police or other internal security forces which engage in the systematic violation of human rights. See page 448. Comment. Prohibiting, quote, efforts to subvert democratic government, end quote, is a vague phrase because there is no standard set as to what constitutes, quote, democratic, end quote, governments. It also raises the problem of what the U.S. may do when a democratic government is headed inexorably toward dictatorship of the right or the left, and that this process may lead to a government which is hostile to America. Here again, we are confronted with the problem of putting out a fire while it is small, as opposed to waiting until it becomes a conflagration. In some instances, it is necessary for U.S. intelligence services to cooperate with the internal security forces of nations where there is systematic violation of human rights. The purpose of such cooperation is to gain foreign intelligence on vital targets. In order to gain the cooperation of the internal security forces in these countries, support is sometimes a condition for cooperation. In a world where the number of authoritarian regimes far outnumbers the number of democratic governments, such a prohibition limits the flexibility of our intelligence services in defending America. Committee Report 39. By statute, any covert use by the U.S. government of American citizens as combatants should be preceded by notification required for all covert actions. The statute should provide that within 60 days of such notification, such use shall be terminated unless the Congress has specifically authorized such use. The Congress should be empowered to terminate such use at any time. See page 449. Comment. If such a statute is enacted, the intelligence services will have to place greater reliance on foreign mercenaries for covert action. While I have no objection to the use of foreigners for this purpose, Americans are much more likely to serve loyally and courageously. Committee Report 42. The committee is concerned about the integrity of American academic institutions for clandestine purposes. Accordingly, the committee recommends that the CIA amend its internal directives to require that individual academies, end of page 585, beginning page 586, used for operational purposes by the CIA, together with the president or equivalent official of the relevant academic institutions, be informed of the clandestine CIA relationship. See page 456. Comment. While I believe that any institution or organization has the right to take positions on domestic or foreign policy issues, I also believe each individual American has the right to cooperate with his government in its lawful pursuits. I submit this right should apply to academics, clergymen, businessmen, union members, newsmen, etc. The more groups we exclude from assisting the intelligence community, the poorer our intelligence will be. Surely, our values have been turned upside down when cooperating with the CIA is viewed as unseemly or degrading. Committee Report 54. By statute, the CIA should be prohibited from causing, funding, or encouraging actions by liaison services which are forbidden to the CIA. Furthermore, the fact that a particular project, action, or activity of the CIA is carried out through or by a foreign liaison service should not relieve the agency of its responsibilities for clearance with the agency, within the executive branch, or with the Congress. See page 459. Comment. In order to gain foreign intelligence, the CIA sometimes enters into liaison operations with foreign services who may engage in activities that would be unacceptable within the United States. Some of these services are creatures of governments whose policies, both domestic and foreign, are unpalatable to American public opinion. The problem with Recommendation 54 is the use of the word, quote, funding, end quote. It may not always be possible for the CIA to fully determine how funds to foreign services have in fact been used. Committee Report 55. The Intelligence Oversight Committee of Congress should be kept fully informed of agreements negotiated with other governments through intelligence channels. See page 459. Comment. If this requirement comes into effect, foreign intelligence services are going to be reluctant to enter into liaison agreements with the CIA. Public disclosure of CIA activities over the past few years has already had a chilling effect on liaison operations. Let's not compound the felony. Committee Report 64. By statute, the General Counsel should be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. See page 461. End of page 586, beginning page 587. Comment. It is contrary to precedent to have the general counsels of agencies and bureaus nominated by the President and subject to Senate confirmation. The general counsel of any agency should be the choice of its chief executive officer. Committee Report 68. B. The director of the CIA should be appointed by the President and subject to confirmation by the United States Senate. Either the director or deputy director should be a civilian. See page 465. Comment. Why should the director or deputy director of the CIA be a civilian? First, this implies a lack of integrity or ability among our uniformed services. Second, the CIA was created to provide a civilian organization that, among other things, would offset any bias in the military intelligence services. Committee Report 69. By statute, a charter for the NSA should be established which, in addition to setting limitations on the operation of the agency, see Domestic Subcommittee recommendations, would provide that the director of NSA would be nominated by the President and subject to confirmation by the Senate. The director should serve at the pleasure of the President, but for not more than 10 years. Either the director or deputy director should be a civilian. See page 465. Comment. I agree that a charter for the NSA is desirable because the NSA is a service organization under the Department of Defense. I fail to see why the director should be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. NSA has a large proportion of civilians, and I can see no valid reason for prohibiting one of them rising to director or deputy director. Nevertheless, Recommendation 69 repeats the implied insult mentioned above in connection with the DIA. So it skips to section L, and if that's what these all are recommendations supposed to be listed in numerical order. Obviously it skips around. So resuming the reading. Section L, the Department of State and Ambassadors. Committee Report 71. The National Security Council, the Department of State, and the Central Intelligence Agency should promptly issue instructions implementing Public Law 93-475, 22 U.S.C. 2680A. These instructions should make clear that ambassadors are authorized recipients of sources and methods of information concerning all intelligence activities, including espionage and counterintelligence operations. Parallel instructions from other components of the intelligence community should be issued to their respective field organizations. End of page 587, beginning page 588. And operatives, copies of all these instructions should be made available to the Intelligence Oversight Committee of Congress. See page 468. 72. In the exercise of their statutory responsibilities, ambassadors should have the personal right, which may not be delegated, of access to the operational communications of the CIA's clandestine service in the country to which they are assigned. Any exceptions should have the approval of the President and be brought to the attention of the Oversight Committee. See page 468. Comment. As a general statement, I cannot take exception to the concept that ambassadors should be privy to all of the activities within their missions. There may be instances where the chief of station believes that the identity of a particular intelligence source should not be made known to the ambassador. Rather than giving the ambassador the final say under these circumstances, I believe both the ambassador and the chief of station should have the right to appeal to the Secretary of State and the DCI. Recommendation 72 is closely related to Recommendation 71 in that it extends the ambassador's authority over to the CIA chief of station. Here again, I believe the general statement is correct, but that provision should be made for exceptional cases, as previously stated. I believe exceptions in some cases should be worked out between the Secretary of State and the DCI, rather than having to be submitted directly to the President. I have refused to sign the final report of the Select Committee on Intelligence Activities, in the belief that it will cause severe embarrassment, if not grave harm, to the nation's foreign policy. A lengthy report of this nature, produced under heavy deadline pressure, further increases the possibility of embarrassment and unintentional security violations. Finally, the majority report tends to blacken the reputation of agencies and persons who have served America well. Senate Resolution 21, that created the Select Committee, held the promise of a calm and deliberate investigation. That promise was not fulfilled. And this is a report that probably should never have been written. Barry Goldwater. The end of page 588, beginning of page 589. That'll be the end of this episode.